For over 500 years, massive stone walls were the ultimate cheat code of European warfare. If you had a castle, you were practically invincible, until history met a very angry, highly explosive black dust. This isn't just the story of a new weapon. It is the story of a social sledgehammer that shattered the feudal age. But before it could destroy the power of knights and lords, gunpowder began its journey as a complete accident. Imagine you're a Chinese alchemist in the 9th century. During the Tang dynasty, you have one job: find the elixir of immortality. So, you mix saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. You're hoping for eternal life. Instead, you get a violent flash of heat and colorful smoke. Congratulations, you failed to cure death. But you just invented the most efficient way to cause it. They called it huo yao, or fire medicine. At first, the Chinese didn't use it to blow up cities. They used it to scare away evil spirits with loud firecrackers. But humanity is incredibly creative when it comes to conflict. Soon, fire medicine was weaponized into fire arrows and toxic smoke bombs. By the Song dynasty, engineers were creating the first primitive flamethrowers and bamboo fire lances. It was chaotic, loud, and terrifying. And then came the Mongols. When Genghis Khan's successes swept across Asia, they didn't just bring horses and bows, they absorbed Chinese engineering. The Mongols weaponized gunpowder on a massive scale, using ceramic bombs and rudimentary cannons to shock their enemies into submission. As the Mongol Empire expanded, it created the Pax Mongolica, reopening the Silk Road and allowing ideas to flow rapidly from east to west. Along with silk, spices, and unfortunately the bubonic plague, the secret formula for black powder hitched a ride towards the Middle East and Europe. Europe was a patchwork of warring lords hiding in stone boxes. They had no idea that their entire way of life was about to explode. By the 13th century, the secret recipe reached the Islamic world. Arab chemists refined the powder, purifying saltpeter to make it burn even hotter and faster. Through Mediterranean trade routes and conflicts in Spain, this refined explosive finally breached the borders of Christian Europe. The continent would never be the same. Enter Roger Bacon, an English monk and philosopher. Around 1267, he became one of the first Europeans to write down the exact formula for gunpowder. Bacon realized how dangerous this stuff was. He actually hid the recipe inside a confusing anagram, hoping to keep the destructive power away from warring kings. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. By the early 1300s, European blacksmiths were already trying to stuff this magical fire powder into iron tubes. Behold, the hand gone. It was literally just an iron pipe strapped to a wooden pole. It had no trigger, no sights, and horrible accuracy. To fire it, a very brave, or very foolish, soldier had to shove a red-hot wire into a tiny touch hole while simultaneously trying to aim. These early firearms were almost as deadly to the user as the target. The poorly cast metal often cracked, exploding right in the shooter's hands. Yeah, early medieval firearms were basically heavily armored men pointing explosive metal pipes and just praying for the best. Not exactly sniper material, but even with terrible aim, the psychological impact was massive. Take the Battle of Crécy in 1346, one of the first European battles to feature cannons. The English brought a few primitive cannons called ribaedequins. They barely killed anyone, but the deafening roar and flashing fire absolutely terrified the French cavalry horses. The European kings quickly realized something crucial. These loud fire tubes were terrible at hitting moving soldiers. But you know what doesn't move? Castles. For centuries, sieges were long, boring, and incredibly expensive. You basically surrounded a castle and waited months for the people inside to starve. But what if you could just smash the walls to pieces? To do that, military engineers needed to scale up. They stopped making little iron pipes. They started pouring massive amounts of bronze to cast giant, terrifying monsters. The era of the great bombards had officially begun. If we are talking about impenetrable stone boxes, we have to talk about the absolute final boss of medieval castles, the great city of Constantinople. For 1,000 years, the legendary Theodosian walls protected the Byzantine Empire, triple-layered, incredibly thick, and basically laughing at any catapult or trebuchet. Enter the year 1453. The ambitious 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, decides he wants the city, and he will not take no for an answer. But Mehmed knew that a traditional siege would just lead to starvation for his own army. He needed a technological miracle. He needed raw firepower. Luckily for him, a Hungarian engineer named Urban showed up. Urban was a freelance gunsmith, essentially the ultimate medieval defense contractor looking for a massive payday. Urban confidently told the Sultan that he could cast a bronze cannon so powerful it would shatter even the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed gave him a blank check. Urban went to work, casting the basilic, a monstrous 26-foot-long bronze tube that fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. This thing was an absolute logistical nightmare. It required 60 oxen and 400 men just to drag it 2 miles a day toward the city. By April, the monster was finally aimed at the ancient walls. The Byzantine defenders looked down at this massive metal tube with growing anxiety. Operating the Great Bombard was terrifying. It took hours just to load the massive marble ball and pack the enormous amount of volatile black powder. When it fired, the boom could be heard for miles. A massive shockwave flattened the grass, and a huge cloud of colorful smoke engulfed the battlefield. The half-ton marble ball slammed into the 1,000-year-old stone. The invincible Theodosian wall didn't just crack, it pulverized into a cloud of dust and rubble. The psychological terror was just as devastating. The deafening roar and shaking ground made the defenders feel like the literal end of the world had arrived. It wasn't perfect. The cannon got so hot it only fired a few times a day. They literally bathed it in warm oil to stop it cracking. But the damage was done. Constantinople fell. The impenetrable fortress was dead. Gunpowder had officially dragged Europe, kicking and screaming, out of the Middle Ages. The news of Constantinople's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. Kings realized their expensive stone castles were now just expensive stone tombs. Architects frantically redesigned defenses, creating the low, thick, angled star forts to deflect cannonballs. But out on the open battlefield, a different crisis was brewing. If giant stone walls couldn't protect you anymore, what about personal, wearable steel walls? Enter the peak of medieval engineering, full plate armor. By the late 1400s, knights were literally walking tanks. They were practically immune to swords, spears, and regular arrows. But maintaining a knight was astronomically expensive. It required decades of combat training, specialized war horses, and a literal fortune in custom-fitted steel. Then, European gunsmiths upgraded the clunky hand cannon. They added a wooden stock, a trigger, and a slow-burning fuse. This was the arquebus. The matchlock mechanism was genius. No more poking a hot wire with your hand. You pull the trigger, the glowing match drops into the powder pan, and bang! It was a massive leap in ergonomics. But more importantly, the arquebus was the ultimate social equalizer. Take an ordinary peasant who has been farming dirt his whole life. Give him this gun and a couple of weeks of basic drill training. Suddenly, this untrained farmer could punch a hole right through a nobleman's astronomically expensive armor from 50 yards away. The physics of power had fundamentally changed. Muscle energy and lifelong swordsmanship were instantly replaced by raw, chemical kinetic energy. Kings quickly did the math. Why hire one highly demanding, arrogant aristocratic knight, when the same money could arm 1,000 obedient peasants with guns? Armor makers tried to fight back. To stop the deadly new bullets, they had to start making breastplates thicker and heavier. To prove it worked, they would shoot the armor once with a pistol before selling it. That physical dent was literal proof that the suit was bulletproof. But eventually, guns got so powerful that armor became comically heavy. Knights couldn't even walk. The glorious age of chivalry was officially shot to pieces, with stone castles shattered and heavily armored knights rolling around like flipped turtles. Warfare had to completely reinvent itself. Welcome to the era of big money. Guns didn't just stay stationary anymore. Engineers put these massive bronze cannons on specialized wooden wheels, creating the terrifying, mobile, artillery train. But here was the catch. Artillery trains were outrageously expensive. You needed imported sulfur, tons of rare copper, and highly paid specialist engineers. In the old days, a local baron or duke could just hide in his castle and ignore the king. Not anymore. Local lords simply couldn't afford cannons. You know who could afford them? The king. By centralizing national taxes, monarchs suddenly had the deep pockets required to buy the ultimate weapons. Kings essentially went on a military shopping spree, building massive royal arsenals. The balance of power shifted from the scattered nobility directly to the crown. If a local lord rebelled, the king didn't have to wait outside his castle for a year. He just rolled up with the royal artillery. Usually, the rebellious lord would take one look at the massive bronze cannons pointed at his front door, and immediately wave the white flag. Historians call this the monopoly on violence. The central government was now the only entity capable of waging actual war, ending the chaotic feudal system. This newly centralized wealth also allowed kings to do something unprecedented. They stopped relying on seasonal peasant levies and started paying full-time professional soldiers. Behold, the birth of the standing army. Men who trained every single day, wearing standardized uniforms, fighting with deadly synchronized precision. They developed the pike and shot formation, a solid block of men holding 18-foot spears, surrounded by musketeers firing devastating volleys of lead. If enemy cavalry tried to attack, they hit a wall of spikes. If they stayed back, they got shot to pieces. Infantry was officially the new king. Because of this, the size of European armies exploded. We went from small, localized skirmishes to massive national conflicts involving tens of thousands of troops. Gunpowder had successfully unified nations and birthed the modern state. But soon, these newly empowered European empires would turn their explosive gaze outward. Across the ocean. For thousands of years, fighting on the ocean basically meant ramming your boat into another boat and jumping over with a sword. Early attempts to put cannons on ships were highly problematic. If you put a heavy bronze bombard on the top deck, the ship just flipped over. But in the early 1500s, an ingenious shipwright came up with a simple but revolutionary idea, the watertight gunport. Instead of putting cannons on the roof, they cut doors near the bottom. This lowered the center of gravity, allowing ships to carry dozens of heavy guns. The result was the floating fortress known as the galleon. It was a masterpiece of engineering that completely dominated the high seas. Firing a full broadside was terrifying. When a cannon fired, the recoil would violently throw the 2-ton metal beast backward across the deck. Interestingly, the cannonball itself wasn't always the biggest killer. When heavy iron smashed into an oak hull, it created a deadly shotgun blast of giant wooden splinters. Naval tactics changed forever. Ramming was out. Ships now sailed in a parallel line of battle, unleashing hellish walls of lead and fire at each other. Armed with these floating artillery platforms, European powers like Spain and Portugal exploded onto the world stage, locking down global trade hubs. They didn't just explore, they conquered. A single heavily armed galleon possessed more firepower than entire armies in the Americas or Asia. This was the birth of gunboat diplomacy. If a local ruler refused an unfair trade deal, the warship would simply park offshore and point its guns. It created an unstoppable feedback loop. Spices and gold flowed back to Europe, funding even bigger armies, which built even bigger guns, to conquer even more land. Everywhere the Europeans went, they brought their new architecture. Geometric star forts popped up in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The gunpowder revolution had officially gone worldwide. But while the ships and empires grew massive, the infantry's guns still had a very fatal flaw. If it rained, the matchlock was just an expensive club. The military needed a spark of genius. They needed the flintlock. The flintlock was a mechanical masterpiece. A piece of flint strikes steel, creating sparks that instantly ignite the powder pan. Simple, elegant, and weather-resistant. No more glowing match cords meant infantry could finally pack tightly together shoulder to shoulder without accidentally setting their buddies' gunpowder on fire. Training improved dramatically. With a flintlock, a highly disciplined soldier could now load and fire 3 entire shots in a single minute. But there was still a major problem. Musketeers were completely defenseless while reloading. They still desperately needed guys with long pikes to stop cavalry. Keeping pikemen around meant fewer guns firing. The first lazy solution was the plug bayonet, literally just shoving a dagger directly into the gun barrel. If a cavalry charge is coming, and your knife is stuck blocking the bullet, you can't shoot. Enter the genius, socket bayonet, in the 1690s. Suddenly, every musketeer was also a pikeman. They could fire a devastating volley of lead and immediately brace for a cavalry charge without switching weapons. This single piece of metal revolutionized army composition. The dedicated pikeman, a staple of warfare for thousands of years. was suddenly, and permanently, unemployed. Armies transitioned to 100% firearms. To maximize this terrifying new firepower, European generals developed what we now call linear tactics. You see, smoothbore muskets had no rifling grooves. The round lead ball bounced around inside the barrel, making it comically inaccurate past 50 yards. If you aim at a single guy, you'll probably miss, but if 500 men fire simultaneously at another group of 500 men, someone is definitely going to get hit. The goal was to create a dense, unavoidable flying wall of lead across the battlefield. Soldiers wearing brightly colored uniforms, like the famous British redcoats, would stand shoulder to shoulder in long, thin lines, completely exposed to enemy fire. It sounds completely insane today. Two giant armies standing just paces apart, staring each other down through thick smoke, trading devastating volleys like absolute clockwork. This was the peak of the Gunpowder Age. War had become a highly organized, industrialized machine of death, and it was about to change the map of the world forever. When the thick smoke finally cleared from centuries of gunpowder warfare, Europe was completely unrecognizable. The medieval world was dead and buried. That accidental mix of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal didn't give those ancient Chinese alchemists eternal life. But in a way, it did give birth to the modern world. It blasted apart the thick stone walls of castles, ensuring that rebellious lords could no longer hide. It made full plate armor obsolete, forcing knights off their high horses. In their place rose massive, professional standing armies. Kings centralized their power, collecting national taxes to afford the staggering cost of artillery trains. In a weird twist of fate, cannons basically built the modern government. Because you need a massive bureaucracy just to count all the tax money and pay the troops. This monopoly on violence stopped the endless squabbling of local barons. It created clear borders, unified laws, and built the roads needed to move those heavy guns. And when they put those heavy cannons on wooden galleons, it sparked an era of global empires, connecting the separated continents through trade and conquest. Gunpowder also forced humanity to master chemistry, metallurgy, and physics. To build a better weapon, you had to understand the very laws of nature. The exact same engineering techniques used to cast perfectly round bronze bombards would eventually be used to cast the iron cylinders of the steam engine. The Gunpowder Age didn't just end the medieval era. It directly paved the way for the Industrial Revolution and the modern world we live in today. From a magical potion meant to ward off evil spirits, to a terrifying weapon that conquered continents, black powder is the ultimate catalyst of human history. So, the next time you look up and watch a beautiful fireworks display illuminating the night sky on New Year's Eve, remember that you are looking at the exact same chemical reaction that shattered empires, ended the age of chivalry, and violently drew the modern map of the world. It is a terrifying, yet awe-inspiring reminder of how human innovation can reshape reality in the blink of an eye. Or the spark of a fuse. Thanks for surviving this historical barrage with us. If you learned something new, hit that subscribe button before the next volley fires. See you next time.